So I need to begin by recognizing that I didn't choose these passages. They're sort of an interesting group of passages to have for Armistice Day. But here they are. We want to start with the book of Ruth, the story we just read. And usually I like Ruth, and it comes around fairly regularly in the lectionary. And I like preaching from Ruth because it's a good story. But it's a bit of a long and complicated story. But this, like when you divide it into chunks, you have to read, just small pieces. And these particular chunks, for me, really highlight sort of the underside of the story. This is not a pretty story. So, the story. So there's Boaz, and he's a wealthy farmer, which means that he doesn't really work at all. He's got slaves for this. And his slaves go out there, and they harvest the grain. He sort of shows up once in a while to supervise, right, make sure things are going okay. But otherwise, he sits at home, has a good time. His slaves do the work for him. He has a relative whose name is Naomi, and whose daughter-in-law is Ruth. Now, after the slaves go through the field and do all the harvesting, then after that, the poor are allowed to come behind and pick up leftovers. Whatever the slaves didn't pick up the first time, the poor get to come behind and pick up whatever happens to be left. And that's what they have to live off. So they're living off, they're sort of like on the social scale, they're sort of below the slaves, because the slaves have guaranteed food. And the poor don't. So Naomi and Ruth, they're down there below the slaves. So Naomi says to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, this is not a long-term idea. This is not good for survival. So what you need to do is make yourself all pretty, get yourself ready, go down to the threshing floor, and make yourself available. So she goes down to the threshing floor and makes herself available to Boaz, and he finds her acceptable, available, there, and so ends up marrying her. Right? We don't know if this is his first wife or his second wife or his eighth wife, but anyway, he ends up marrying her. She conceives and bears a son, and so she goes from the poorest of the poor up to the wealthy. So the lesson here is that if you are willing to put yourself under the power of the patriarchy, you can jump if you're pretty and willing enough. You can jump from being one of the poor to being one of the wealthy, and all the rest of them poor and all the slaves, they can take care of themselves. Right? Good for you. The word of the Lord. I said, I didn't write this. I didn't even choose it. And the psalm is in the same sort of vein. Right? The psalm says, right, you need a quiver full of sons. Now, my grandpa had a quiver full of sons. My mom has 6 brothers, or had 6 brothers at one point. Because back in those days, there was just a lot of land to farm. And so my grandpa figured, well, let's just keep, producing help for the farm. And this worked well, but that's not what the psalm says. The psalm doesn't say, this is to keep you up in your old age. The last verse in the psalm says, because these sons, their job is to back you up in a legal dispute. That when you're in a legal dispute, that's what they did at the town gates, you've got to be ready for some, to back up your words with some force. And that's what brings justice. A quiver full of sons. Doesn't get any better. The First Kings story starts out in the context of a struggle between 2 patriarchal systems. There's Elijah and his God, and then there's the king who's sort of not big into this God thing, but just wants to be king. And they get into this fight, and Elijah says, no more rain for 3 years. Now the king's going to keep eating, because he's the king. But the rest of Israel and surrounding territories goes without rain. Which means that this woman, who isn't even Israelite, who doesn't even live in Israel, but the famine gets a bit bigger, is about to die. And Elijah comes to her and says, but put yourself under the power of the patriarchy and I will take care of you. Never mind her neighbors. Never mind all the people in Israel who are slowly also starving to death because of this little contest between Elijah and the king. Horrible stories this morning. Why all these horrible stories? Today is Veterans Day. And as Linda reminded me earlier, this used to be called Armistice Day. And Armistice Day was to celebrate, like Blair said, the end of World War I, which was the Great War, the war to end all wars, which didn't turn out so well. But at least, right, at least this day used to be dedicated to going, hey, you know, peace is an option here. We really want to end this stuff. That was what Armistice Day was about. Like, it was a phenomenally stupid war. And the only thing that really came out of World War I was World War II, and millions of deaths. But otherwise, right? But Armistice Day was this little time when people were hopeful, this little hope for peace. And today, instead, it has become Veterans Day, which is a celebration of the endless war. And I was at the football game yesterday, and there was war this and war that, and veterans this and veterans that, and no talk at all about it ever ending. It's just going to go on forever. There was a little clip played on the big screen from, I didn't catch the context, you know, but it's like the person speaking said, we are preparing for Armageddon in the hope that it will, or for the sole purpose of preventing it. Which, you know, so this is where we've come. And again, to remember this all in the context of church history. That for the first 300 years of the church's existence, the church said no to war. Christians do not become soldiers, they do not go to war. It's just the way, right? Jesus said, love your enemy, and it's sort of hard to love your enemy and stab him at the same time. So let's just be honest about what it is we can and can't do here. Then the church made this bargain with Constantine, or Constantine took over the church, or however you want to say this. But even after that, war remained a sin. Killing in war was a sin, and so, yes, Christians could be in the army. When they came back, they had to do penance. They had to repent. They had to acknowledge the sin that they had committed as part of the war effort, and they were offered forgiveness. Right? And then, 700 years of that went past, and then, or, today, right, war is this great duty. It's a great and wonderful thing that we should all be celebrating. And today, willingness to kill has become the highest form of national service. When people talk about service to this country, it's usually about the willingness to kill. Now let's also remember that for many soldiers, they don't go into this to try to kill. They go into this out of financial necessity. They go into this because family history says that this is what young men do. They go into this because that's their only way they're going to ever get into college. And they come out of this with all sorts of problems, and there is something truly horrible about the way soldiers are treated in this country when they come back. They're treated as heroes and then they're discarded. And so it's tricky. So, as a church, what we traditionally do when things are tricky is we look to Jesus. At least that's what we should be doing. And the Old Testament, as we've seen, is tricky, but the New Testament is also tricky. So Jesus is sitting there, and he's watching the money being put into the treasury of the temple. And it's important to realize that the temple in Jesus' day was part of the apparatus of the state, indirectly connected, right, which was the Roman state, occupying force. And so the temple was actually maintaining an institution that maintained the Roman power and privilege. He said, we are a special people, but yeah, we're going to have to cooperate with the Romans still, for now. And so people who were giving money So it's all tricky. And Jesus watched them put money in the temple, and he says to this woman, he says to the disciples, that woman who put in her last 2 cents, she's given more than all the others. So in some ways, this story highlights God's sort of preference for the poor. God doesn't look to the wealthy and the rich and the powerful and say, see, I have blessed them with great abundance. But rather he looks to the poor and he says, no, that's where I am. That's where my blessings. Tricky. On the other hand, people have looked at this passage and go, why is this woman putting her last 2 pennies in the offering plate? That's all she's got. Why? This is an institution that contributes to her oppression, this temple that she's putting money in the offering plate of. Why is she doing that? Why is Jesus saying this is a good idea at all? I heard a story like this in Ghana. Remember the story, dear? We were in church one Sunday, and a woman stood up. They do a lot of sharing in their churches because service is 3 hours long, so you got to do something, right? And so a woman stood up and she told the story of how she came to church the previous Sunday, and she had 2 CDs, 50 cents. This was how much money she had total. And she had to decide on Sunday morning whether to put her 2 CDs into the offering basket or use them to feed her children for lunch. And she chose to put them in the offering basket. And then, as she was walking home after church, she was walking past the field that she had. She had a small field where she grew mango seedlings. She grew little mango trees that turned into big mango trees that produced mangoes. And somebody stopped her and bought 30 mango seedlings worth 300 CDs. So she felt there was a connection between her willingness to give to God and the 300 CDs she was blessed with, right, so she could go home and feed her family for quite a while. And me, the rich white missionary, I got nothing. Right? How do I respond to a story like that? Because in some ways, if she'd have asked me beforehand, do I put my 2 CDs into the offering plate, I'd have no idea what I would have said. I'm glad she didn't ask. Yeah, so people make these sort of decisions, and because, and this is connected to Veterans Day, because all of this or so much of this is about wealth and power. And so when we think about veterans today, it's worth understanding that in this system we have today, in our military system, somebody is getting really, really rich off this system, and it sure isn't the veterans. There's a huge amount of money being thrown around at this, that, and the next thing. And it's not the average soldier who's getting this. And we get these stories in the Old Testament about the patriarchy and how great this all is, and Jesus comes and turns it on its head. So what do we as a Peace Church have to offer? Now, obviously, the group of us here are not going to change the world. But we are, a little bit. Each of us can go and change the world a little bit. And one thing we can offer is a place of honesty. That instead of falsely going, yay, soldiers, we're going to be honest here about the plight of soldiers and the reality of soldiers and the reality of the ongoing war that has no purpose, has no end. It's just nothing but money flowing here and there and people somewhere else dying. Or this week, people in California dying because some soldier came back and couldn't handle life here. People die here too. And to also recognize that even after we had this election, no party has the least bit interested in stopping this system. Right? The Democrats are just as excited about funding all of this as the Republicans are. that's not a choice that we have to make. And I think, honestly, we as a Peace Church can say to veterans that we are, in some odd ways, on your side here. We recognize you as people who have sometimes done horrible things, and we're going to offer you a place of repentance and forgiveness. We're going to offer you a place of honesty, and I'll let you to tell your story. We are on your side. And we recognize that ultimately this is all part of the larger war on the poor that is ongoing and is ramping up. We want to be a place of honesty about all of that. And it's hard to know how to respond. It's hard to know what to do. Right? Do we do another vigil? Do we not do another vigil? Do we do something else other than a vigil? Because vigils, it's the usual dozen people who show up. So we do small things. One of the small things we do, which doesn't feel like much, but is something worth doing, is we sing. Something about just singing together that reminds us of who we are and of the work that there is to do, the fact that we are going to do this together. And it's not a very big group for singing, but we can still sing joyfully. You don't need a big group to sing joyfully. So I invite you